Hello everyone, my name's Jenna-Lee Beer-Procter, and I'm going to be talking about one of them, an introduction to non-binary genders. I just want to thank, I'm not sure if it's Path essay, I'm still trying to figure that out. Pathso, but thank you for inviting me to do this talk. I've been very excited about it. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been working for the Department of Health for several years in the intellectual disability services, but I've also in my private capacity been doing therapy with trans and queer people. So actually from next week onwards I'm going to be doing private practice full-time, and I'll be working exclusively with LGBTIQ people, which is quite exciting. Additionally, I am trans, non-binary, and queer, and gay married, or as my wife likes to say, personally, politically, and professionally queer. It's not quite appropriate to say, but gay for pay.
Can't say gay for pay.
Anyway, my pronouns are they, them, and so this leads quite well into the next or the first part, which is about introducing terms and definitions. So it might be a bit like Trans 101, and some of you are definitely familiar with a lot of these terms and concepts, but I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page before we really get more into the non-binary stuff. And then just to say that these are 3 really helpful websites that you can go to that will give you a lot more of this information in detail. The genderbread person has been a sort of useful concept or diagram to explain the differences between gender, sex, gender expression, orientation, and attraction. They define it as breaking a complicated concept into bite-sized, digestible pieces. It's a great way to understand sexual and gender diversity and these aspects of ourselves that are not all the same. For example, you could be cisgender, so the sex assigned at birth is congruent with your gender identity. We'll get into that later. And you present or express yourself in ways that correspond with traditional gender norms and be heterosexual in every aspect. Or you could be AFAB and cisgender, a lesbian, but homoromantic and bisexual. Or AMAB, trans woman, hetero, etc. They're very, very many variations. But genderbread person, as you can see, is still very binary. So what happens if you're non-binary? Enter the gender unicorn. It includes an other, which goes beyond the binary of male, female, straight, gay, bi, cis, trans, etc. It allows for more space for people who are non-binary or asexual, fluid, intersex, etc. Demi-gender, demi-boys, demi-girls, we'll get into that too. What you will notice though is that under the gender identity expression assigned at birth, physically attracted and emotionally attracted to, that there's still arrows, there's still a line. Whereas I prefer to think of it more as a kaleidoscope or a spectrum in the shape of a color wheel rather than a line from M to F with X or other in between or somewhere else. So to start off with, I'm going to go and just explain some definitions and terms briefly. And there are going to be quite a few I'm not going to include here because I'm going to talk about them in more detail later. But if we start off with gender identity, so it's one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both, or other genders. Everyone has a gender identity, including you. For transgender people, their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity are not necessarily the same. So cisgender. That's an adjective that means that identifies as their sex assigned at birth, derived from the Latin word meaning on the same side. A cisgender or cis person is not transgender. Cisgender does not indicate biology, gender expression, or sexuality, sexual orientation. In discussions regarding trans issues, one would differentiate between women who are trans and women who aren't by saying trans women and cis women. Cis is not a fake word and it is not a slur. Note that cisgender does not have an ed at the end. Cissexism, we'll definitely be talking about this more, but it's the systemic prejudice in the favor of cisgender people. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Then transgender or trans spectrum or the umbrella or trans and gender diverse. So it's an umbrella term for people whose gender identity differs from the sex they are assigned at birth. The term transgender is not indicative of gender expression, sexual orientation, hormonal makeup, physical anatomy, or how one is perceived in daily life. Note that transgender does not have an ed at the end. So it's not transgendered. Then trans woman, trans man. So trans woman generally describes someone who is assigned male at birth who identifies as a woman. This individual may or may not actively identify as trans. It is grammatically and definitionally correct to include a space between trans and woman. The same concept applies to trans men. Often it is good to just use woman or man. Some trans people will identify as MTF and FTM. So MTF is male to female and MTF is male to female, but it's contested. Not everybody likes that. The non-binaries are a little bit, otherwise. But it is something to be aware of.
Just like everything.
So, okay, I've been talking a lot about assigned at birth. And these are acronyms. So AFAB, or as my wife likes to say, AFabulous, is assigned female at birth, and AMAB is assigned male at birth. No one, whether cis or trans, gets to choose what sex they're assigned at birth. This term is preferred to biological male or female, male, female-bodied, natal male, female, and born male, female, which are defamatory and inaccurate. So intersex is also included in here, which the genderbread man didn't do. Sorry, person. Intersex, it's describing a person with a less common combination of hormones, chromosomes, and anatomy that are used to assign sex at birth. Parents and medical professionals usually coercively assign intersex infants a sex and have, in the past, been medically permitted to perform surgical operations to conform to the infant's genitalia to that assignment. This practice has become increasingly controversial as intersex adults speak out against the practice. The term intersex is not interchangeable with or a synonym for transgender, although some intersex people do identify as trans. Intersex is not non-binary, and we'll definitely get more into that. Sexual orientation. So it's a person's physical, romantic, emotional, aesthetic, and or other form of attraction to others. In Western cultures, gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same. Trans people can be straight, bisexual, lesbian, gay, asexual, pansexual, queer, etc., just like anyone else. For example, a trans woman who is exclusively attracted to other women would often identify as a lesbian. You can get physical, as it says, physical attraction, emotional attraction, romantic attraction. They don't always have to be the same. So you can be physically attracted to certain genders, and emotionally or romantically not. Asexual, should we just go a bit more into that? And that's the lack of sexual attraction and one identifying with this orientation. This may be used as an umbrella term for other emotional attractions such as demisexual. It's the aces, that's how they go.
On the street.
Okay, and then I think the last term to include is queer. a term for people of marginalized gender identities and sexual orientations who are not cisgender and or heterosexual. This term has a complicated history as a reclaimed slur. Being non-binary means that you don't identify as exclusively male or female, that you're out of the gender binary. A trans non-binary person is someone who doesn't identify with the sex that was assigned at birth, and also has a gender identity that can't be categorized as exclusively male or female. So for some non-binary people, they feel like a blend of both, whatever, genders, while others might feel like they don't identify with either gender. But again, if we think about gender as not being on a binary, but rather a kaleidoscope or a plethora of gender, then there'd be multiple boxes that non-binary people can play around with. It's very complicated, but it also doesn't have to be. So that is the the explanation, like the Trans 101 definition of non-binary. But as you can see in the little meme on the left, is that when non-binary people talk to each other and we really break down what gender is and what our genders are, it can actually get quite fun.
Complicated.
Fun. There's a bit of a debate about which one's the bigger umbrella, non-binary or genderqueer. That sometimes people use them interchangeably, sometimes people say that they're completely different. But if we start with the definition of genderqueer, or one of the definitions, we've got to queer everything up, an identity commonly used by people who do not identify or express their gender within the gender binary. Those who identify as genderqueer may identify as neither male nor female, may see themselves as outside of or in between the binary gender boxes, or may simply feel restricted by gender labels. Many genderqueer people are cisgender and identify with it as an aesthetic. Not everyone who identifies as genderqueer identifies as trans or non-binary. So if we come back to the term non-binary, there's multiple categories here. You could be bi, tri, or polygender. You could have no gender, so agender or non-gendered or genderless or gender-free. You could move between various genders and have a fluctuating gender, which is often referred to as gender fluid. Or some people refer to themselves as having a third or other gender, where they just don't place a name to their gender. I'm going to play a piece from the BBC's Enbys podcast, which I highly, highly recommend. It's an 8-part series, and it's very insightful. And this piece is on how people are describing how they identify, why they use those terms, why they're not, and really the politics behind it.
It's really interesting to me as well. How do you identify? What language do you use for yourself?
This is one of the first times I've ever been asked this question, and I don't have an answer prepared. I say non-binary, and I sometimes say gender fluid. At this point, I'd literally never called myself gender fluid before in my life. I was just trying it out. And I use they, and that's tricky because it feels like a transitional in and of itself, and it's hard to get your head around the idea that is just going to be like a constant kind of hinterland that you're in.
I would use the language genderqueer. I'm older than you, right? And that's certainly the language that I use, that I think I see increasingly replaced by the term non-binary. Yeah. And I remember when I was coming out, when I was young as queer, the older LGBT people would say that that's possibly not a word that they would have used, but that I found very empowering. I kind of feel like I am now that granddad myself, looking at non-binary people, because I don't like the term non-binary. I find it really problematic that people are starting their description of their gender freedom with a negative. I find it difficult that they are also defining themselves as not being normative. So in a way, the term non-binary reinforces that there is a binary, and I don't think it gives creative and spiritual freedom, enough freedom, to people that are actually in this incredibly vast space that is the breadth of the spectrum, you know, at their fingertips, and said, no, I'm not a binary, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel, I see what you're saying. There's something about non-binary that works for me in that I just feel absolved somehow. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you feel, I feel like I'm not part of the binary. Great. I'm rejecting you. You're not rejecting me. If you see what I'm saying, I'm going, this system's not good for me.
Yeah, and it is actually like actively removing yourself from something, which I definitely identify with as well. But I think for me, like, I feel that I've grasped for a word that other people who are like me are already using.
Quite right.
And that's like sort of useful enough to be getting on with.
Quite right, and it's the last thing that I really, you know, necessarily need to critique.
Yeah.
It's just something
No, it's
about
so interesting.
that really fast shifting language.
Yeah.
You know, that helps shape our experiences, because it's what we use to label and identify ourselves and each other.
Can we walk over to my favourite?
Not all non-binary people identify as trans, and not all trans people identify as non-binary. Sometimes, and increasingly, non-binary can be used to describe the aesthetic or presentation or expression of a cisgender or transgender person. There are many reasons why non-binary people do and don't identify as trans. One of the reasons why non-binary people don't is because of the historical perceptions that trans is transitioning within the binary. Some may identify with the gender assigned at birth, but also occupy non-binary gender to break with gender stereotypes and expectations, but don't consider themselves trans. Pronouns. So we're familiar with she, her, or he, him, and they, them has become increasingly popular. The Merriam-Webster added it to their dictionary, and them was the word of the year in 2019. In South Africa, most people use these three pronouns, sometimes more than one. Sometimes it's also context related. For example, my pronouns are they, them, but in certain situations where I don't feel safe, I'll go by she, her. Doesn't feel great, but it does feel safer. So then what we have here is the neo-pronouns. So these are gender-neutral pronouns. That's not an exhaustive list. There are more. I know it can be confusing and a bit overwhelming, and pronunciation sometimes becomes an issue. But the key is to just practice. Just keep trying and just practice. That's basically it. Then you also get the xenopronouns. And this definitely seems quite overwhelming, and some people might think that it is too much, but there are outliers. I've never met anyone who, for example, identifies as astral gender, so a gender that feels connected to space to a supreme level. Have a look online. It's a wonderland of adventure. But just to give you the definition, so xenopronouns involve concepts that humans do not have words for. So they're not able to be understood by humans and or expressed through human language. Oh, and on the previous slide with pronouns also comes titles. And we know how problematic titles are. I mean, it's just incredibly sexist with miss or Mrs. But that aside, the gender-neutral title that we have available to us as Enbys is mix. So the MX, that's how it's pronounced. Unless you like me, could finally finish their PhD. Just to mention some common misconceptions. There's no such thing as looking non-binary. Being non-binary doesn't mean you can't have any other gender identity. We are not all intersex, transgender, or anything else people assume we are. Non-binary identity is not just a quirk or a trend. It's been around for thousands of years. We don't feel we are born in the wrong body. We don't have to be equally masculine and feminine to be non-binary, and you don't have to prove that you're non-binary. In closing, being non-binary isn't as difficult or as complicated as it might seem. It's messy and weird in the fact that it's hard to think outside of the box that society constructed for us, but ultimately it's a term that is welcoming and accepting of whatever you need for it to mean to you. It's something you can create for yourself. In part 2, I'm going to be looking at the socio-political context, and I'm going to use the gender minority stress framework. So starting from a broader context before going into the mental health care part in the last section. Essentially, what this is about is saying that mental health problems are not a result of some inherent factor, but a result of external stressors that over time place undue burdens on queer folk. Before we get into the minority stress or gender minority stress framework, straight privilege. So that's cis or heteronormativity. They're two different concepts, cisgenderism or cissexism. But basically, just to define these terms. So heteronormativity is the belief that heterosexuality is the default or preferred or normal mode of sexual orientation. And it assumes the gender binary, that there are only two distinct opposite genders and that sexual and marital relationships are most fitting between people of the opposite sex. A heteronormative view therefore involves alignment of biological sex, sexuality, gender identity, and gender roles. Heteronormativity is linked with heterosexism and homophobia. Cisgenderism goes a bit further. It refers to the cultural and systemic ideology that denies, denigrates, or pathologizes self-identified gender identities that do not align with assigned gender at birth, as well as resulting behavior, expression, and community. This ideology endorses and perpetuates the belief that cisgender identities and expressions are to be valued more than transgender identities and expressions, and creates an inherent system of associated power and privilege. The presence of cisgenderism exists in many cultural institutions, including language and the law, and consequently enables prejudice and discrimination against the transgender community. The pervasive nature of cisgenderism creates, designates, and enforces a hierarchy by which individuals are expected to conform and are punished if they do not. This hierarchy includes rigid beliefs and rules about many aspects of gender, including gender identity, expression, and roles. Individuals who do not conform to these rules are seen as deviant, immoral, and even threatening. In turn, prejudice, discrimination, and even violence are viewed as justifiable in order to protect and preserve this very system that benefits only those in power who created it. Gender binarism may create institutionalized structures of power, and individuals who identify outside traditional gender binaries may experience discrimination and harassment. Some who do not identify within a binary system experience being at the bottom of the hierarchy, even within queer and trans communities. The binary system of gender was enforced as a means of protecting patriarchal norms, oppressive means of reflecting differential power dynamics. Deconstructing the gender binary and revolutionizing the way gender exists in our world are essential to moving the gender equity movement forward. It is not about erasing cis men and women, it's about including everyone else too. Gender equity is meant to be the presence of fairness for all humans of all genders, manifesting in equal treatment or unique treatment. However, gender and gender equity have become synonymous with women and women's rights. This is extremely problematic for two main reasons. First, because it alleviates men's roles and responsibilities in the fight for gender equity. And second, because the needs and rights of humans with a gender outside of the binary are not considered. It is not enough to name this work gender equity if that work doesn't include all genders. The gender minority stress framework is an expansion of the minority stress theory to better explain the health disparities between sexual minorities and their heterosexual counterparts. So it's in relation to cisnormativity, which we spoke about earlier on, the ideology that positions cisgender identities as the norm. And it's useful in assessing minority stressors that are specific to the experiences of trans and gender diverse people. The minority stress framework explains disparities by pointing to the excessive levels of social stress that sexual and gender minority groups are subjected to due to their stigmatization by wider society. It also posits that sexual and gender minorities have more limited or reduced access to common stress alleviating resources that could potentially counteract the effects of heightened and accumulative levels of stress specific to their sexual or gender identities. Essentially the perfect storm. You have too much discrimination and too little support, briefly summarized. There are multiple, the theory has kind of evolved over time, and there's several theorists, and I'm sort of throwing it all together and sort of bastardizing it, but let's see how this goes. So essentially, Mayer introduced the gender minority stress framework in 1995 and then continued with building on his theory in 2003. And how they explained it is that you have distal stressors, which is both macro and microaggressions, but they're external. And then you have the proximal stressors, which are internalized, and this eventually leads to internalized transphobia and negative expectations. So I've gone with other theories to divide them into different categories to make it easier to discuss, which I'll do. The first one is prejudice events. Second one is everyday and chronic discrimination. 3, expectations of rejection. 4, concealment stigma. And 5, internalized stigma. Then what I've just highlighted at the bottom there is because I'm not sure exactly where those would fit into. Probably either number 1 or number 2. But spatial exclusions, that's about societal infrastructure. Which bathrooms do you use? And then judicial gatekeeping is gender markers, ID documents, ticking M and F boxes. Those are also aggressions. So the distal stressors. The first one is prejudice events. So these are once-off experiences of overt discrimination. They're mostly interpersonal. It's often within the family, where the non-binary person is a minority within the family. And it's also, it's unlike, for example, race and ethnic minorities and the discrimination and stresses that they feel, because with being non-binary in a family where everybody else is cis, you're even further marginalized and isolated. Intersectionality is essential, there's no doubt. It's often physical assault, hate crimes, sometimes in public, and it's especially worse in areas where you have compromised legal protections, unlike our South African constitution. And yes, we all have traumas. It's just not all lives matter. I don't want to get into the white privilege, cis privilege, whatever. We all have traumas, but these are additional traumas that are specific to being queer and non-binary. I'm not into the privileged argument right now. Then the second one is everyday and chronic discrimination, which is also referred to as microaggressions. So I guess you could consider them low grade, unobtrusive, but it communicates prejudice, disrespect, and rejection, but not often as easily identifiable. For example, it could be being stared at or ignored, and these erode people's sense of self-worth over time, negatively impacting their mental health and well-being. So proximal stressors, the first one is expectations of rejection, no-brainer. This is where you approach certain situations or social interactions anticipating a negative treatment. This might be because of previous negative experiences or an awareness of wider negative stereotypes of or prejudices against LGBTQIA people. It might not come to pass, but it could. And so there's a type of preparedness that places undue mental and emotional burdens on non-binary people in this case. The second one is the concealment stigma. So it's to conceal their gender to some degree, and it may be context specific, like what I mentioned previously with pronouns. But the purpose is to protect yourself, but it also takes so much effort, and it means that there's levels of inauthenticity, fears of being found out, and obviously all of this takes its toll. Coming from the intellectual disabilities background, one of the theories that's been put forward is the idea of the secondary handicap, in which somebody basically hides their disability, which means that it goes by unrecognized, and the accommodations that they may need, they won't be able to receive. And that can then be further disabling. And obviously it's isolating and lonely. And so in the sort of gender aspect, it's very, very similar. You're not necessarily going to get the support that you need. And then we come to internalized stigma, or what can also be referred to as internalized homophobia or internalized transphobia. So this is the internalized wider society's negative, disparaging, and degrading view of themselves. So it's a condemnation of a person's own gender identity and the dissonance between themselves and how they ought to conform. So this is about shame, feelings of that there's something wrong with you, and it's obviously very damaging. So it's really important to go through some sort of process of, let's call it, giving it back, which is essential to achieving and sustaining a healthy and positive self-image, which is vital for any person's mental and emotional health. Then we cannot neglect the protective factors. So yeah, there's definitely space within this framework, because it is about finding a balance between the discrimination that, again, in this case, non-binary people have to deal with, and the lack of support and lack of access and internalized feelings with the support that they really do get. And a lot of the time that is about belonging, it's about acceptance. It's also that there isn't the social, workplace, health and legal discrimination. That helps when it's actually environments that are probably like gender neutral and gender affirming. And then a big thing is about being proud, and proud of yourself, but also in a collective sense of non-binary pride, as in that there's a high collective self-esteem in the group that you belong to, and that can also be very protective. So part 3, mental health care. This follows on from the previous section in terms of just contextualizing it within that gender minority stress framework. There are definitely other frameworks and theories that can be used. This is just what I've kind of picked for today's presentation. But it's so important that we don't just treat like individuals and place pathology within the individual, that we have to kind of consider the broader context, which is why this work is so political, and that cannot be ignored. I am focusing on mental health because I'm coming from a clinical psychologist perspective, and it's been really difficult to actually like hold back on what is just broader transgender mental health considerations and what is maybe more specific to non-binary. And there's obviously a lot of overlaps, but the thing always comes back to the binary. It comes back to that split between male and female, and where do non-binary people belong. So I'm almost wanting to go into therapy with trans people in general, but that will be an entire presentation on its own. So I do feel like I'm missing things, but I'm going to try and stay focused. Hopefully everybody is aware of the practice guidelines for psychology professionals working with sexually and gender diverse people. This is where you start. Like, you can't do this work without actually looking at that, and then as well as WPATH's standards of care. I'm not going to go into that. We've had like talks and presentations on that before, which was incredibly helpful. But these are readily available online for you to download. So let's just start with the gender affirmative model and the major premises. So the first is gender variations are not disorders. Like, duh. But we still have to reiterate that. The second one is that gender presentations are diverse and varied across cultures, therefore requiring our cultural sensitivity. This is also where language really matters. And something I actually forgot to mention when we were talking about pronouns is that I was just presenting on English pronouns, whereas they differ in different languages, obviously. The third is, to the best of our knowledge, at present, gender involves an interweaving of biology, development, and socialization, and culture and context, with all three bearing on any individual's gender self. 4, gender may be fluid, and it is not binary, both at a particular time and if and when it changes within an individual across time. 5, if there is pathology, it more often stems from cultural reactions, like transphobia, homophobia, and sexism, rather from within the child or adult. So why do non-binary people come to therapy? What's it all about? Often it's that it's a safe space for them just to start exploring their feelings and questions about gender. That they don't feel like that they can do that with their friends or family just yet, and they need a trans positive, non-binary friendly space to be able to do that. It could also be about transitioning and coming out issues, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. Or it's just about like gender affirmation. In this case, referring to an interpersonal, interactive process whereby a person receives social recognition and support for their gender identity and expression. And in the therapy room, that's where sometimes non-binary people are going to experience it for the first time, or get to really, play around and experiment with it within the therapeutic relationship. And then the other thing is just because there isn't necessarily a reason related to being non-binary. They're just non-binary and want to talk about things in therapy. So it's just because they are non-binary doesn't mean that they have a problem with being non-binary. They just don't want a therapist who has a problem with being non-binary. There are many misconceptions about non-binary transitioning. What it is, do you even do it? How do you do it? What does it entail? And again, it comes back to the idea of the binary, of somehow this like crossover between genders. And so if you're non-binary, you're out of the boxes, or you're in between, or whatever, what are you transitioning to? So there are a lot of misconceptions about this. And a lot of non-binary people do transition, and in different ways. So I came across this website, genderqueer.me, or genderqueer.me, and I really found it helpful in how it differentiated between public gender and the sort of private gender, and how for non-binary people in particular it can never quite match up. So non-binary public gender does not exist. So if we think about in fitting rooms, in bathrooms, in clothing stores, even vitamins and deodorant, soaps, love stories, they're all binary, and non-binary people are invisible. So nobody is going to see you or know how you identify. And this presents unique challenges for a non-binary person transitioning. So the non-binary public gender does not exist in society. Therefore, no matter what or how much a non-binary person transitions, they will never be able to be completely affirmed in their identity during every part of their day. So what's the point of non-binary transition then? Well, to get closer to comfortable. Because there are steps we can take that bring us peace, that reduce the dysphoria and bring us closer to being ourselves, close enough to make life livable, so close so that we may be able to forget about our gender outfit for the most part and just live. So often what people do is they come to therapy looking for letters and reports and assessments. They need all those letters from the psychologist, the surgeon, the doctor, the endo, psychiatrist, trying to get medical aids to cover treatment, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of this we know is about gatekeeping. And I think gatekeeping is very, very complex. Trans and gender diverse community do a lot of gatekeeping ourselves for good reason. But a lot of healthcare professionals do a lot of gatekeeping that's very harmful. I don't want to talk about it too much now, but something that I do find interesting that it would be, I think a good idea for further discussion is how gatekeeping isn't necessarily about saying no or rejecting an application or a letter, but about where you're placed on a waiting list. How far down on that waiting list does your name go? Because that is gatekeeping as well. But yeah, what are the, what are the reasons for this? Why is it just about accessibility? It's very complicated. So just some of my own thoughts about transitioning and in therapy. And I'm thinking a lot about how it's relevant to the therapeutic relationship. So I often talk about how gender is relational, and when genders change, relationships change. Even though it's still the same person, that person's, maybe aspects of them have been hidden or haven't been like fully grown into and known. And this also, it means that there's an opportunity for, I guess, a healthier form of relating. So it is very complex, and often when it comes to transitioning, this is also where I, for example, would see partners and do some couples work as well as working with families, because of this idea of gender being relational, is that when a non-binary person transitions, it will also affect how other people experience themselves in relation to the non-binary person. So for example, when I first came out to my partner, I told him right from the beginning, I was like, you need to know what the fuck you're getting into. And she had to go through a bit of an existential thing because she's a lesbian. So what is she now if her partner is non-binary? And it's those kind of complexities that I think we need to be able to give each other space to work through, while also being very, very respectful of non-binary identities. I'm just going to get straight into it. I've got the DSM-5 here in front of me. Gender dysphoria in children. Just going to skip ahead. Number 2. In boys assigned gender, a strong preference for cross-dressing or simulating female attire, or in girls assigned gender, a strong preference for wearing only typical masculine clothing, and a strong resistance to the wearing of typical feminine clothing. Ugh. Is still very binary and also just sexist. It's very problematic, but we are trying. Like, the field is definitely trying to fix past mistakes, but we're still falling short. It does get a little bit better in, when they talk about the gender dysphoria in adolescents and adults. But there's still this idea of other gender, which can be read as opposite. That's the problem. But I guess in brackets they do say, or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. But yes, we know that is still problematic. At least we're now looking at the dysphoria as being the problem and not the gender identity. That's been a very big shift. So what is gender dysphoria? It's the feeling of discomfort or distress that might occur in people whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth or sex-related physical characteristics. It's different from depression, but it's also depressing. And if we consider the gender minority stress framework that I discussed earlier on, it is no surprise that trans and non-binary people have higher prevalence rates of depression, anxiety, and higher risk rates for suicide. We don't have many stats and studies in South Africa that we can actually look at. A lot of them come from the UK, the US, and I came across one for Australia because I was specifically looking for non-binary people, not just trans in general, or cis versus trans, or trans versus gay, lesbian, and bi. There doesn't seem to be a lot of research specifically on non-binary genders. But from this one study in terms of suicide risk, and this was for adolescents, I think ages 11 to 16, that transgender boys had the highest rate of attempted suicide, and it was followed by non-binary adolescents, and then trans girls, and then questioning adolescents, then cisgender girls, and then cisgender boys. So that's the only study that I've managed to find, but I haven't done like a full lit review. But it is something to be very, very aware of. There's so much more that I can actually say about this. I'm busy doing my PhD on suicidality and transgender expressions and identities in South Africa, and one of the things that I've come across is this concept of that suicide is contagious. Because if we consider your risk factors, if you have lost somebody to suicide, then you have a higher chance of actually attempting or dying by suicide yourself. So if we think about how prevalent this is in the trans community and how contagious it is, it means that the risks are like, they just, compounded. It's just, it's like you can't really get away from it. I often get asked about what's my theoretical approach. Am I psychodynamic, CBT, intersubjective, which I do actually find very useful. Definitely bring in a lot of feminist and queer theory and therapies. But I like to think about it as a puspas therapy. Translated into English, it's hodgepodge, eclectic, a mix of. And so, it's basically using all the theory, using everything as a psychologist, what you've been trained in and what you understand, but you have to be deep pathologizing. It's not just about non-pathologizing, but it's actually a very active process of de-pathologizing some of the theories and understandings and the processes with your client. Yes, psychodynamic therapies can be helpful, but they must be adapted. They are incredibly transphobic, but even more so, they're very, very binary. And that's one of the things, is you constantly pushing the boundaries. And I know for myself, if I think about the psychoanalytical psychodynamic frame and the rules and the structure and what kind of provides containment in the therapeutic space and all that kind of stuff, that is really, really important. It's kind of what helps therapy to happen and to work. But it can also be very limiting. And so as a therapist, you need to have like a high tolerance of actually being able to sit with that discomfort, because how you've been trained, you sometimes have to unlearn that, but also not go too far. A very, very significant thing, though, in this work is that you have to be trauma informed. You need to have a good understanding of trauma, the little T's and the big T's, microaggressions and macroaggressions, people's lived and embodied experiences. And if you're cis, you're not always going to be able to have more of a like intuitive understanding. And so it's really important to be very considerate and sensitive to those differences, and also the similarities. Therapist etiquette. So it's a different kind of frame. Just because it's therapy and you're exploring like deep and complicated and very personal issues and experiences and whatnot, it doesn't mean you can ask invasive questions. You have to be sensitive. Like, take the lead from your client, and hold your own stuff back. Don't ask them about their genitals. Don't ask them if they want to have surgeries. Don't let that come up and you explore it together. Come up, excuse the pun. Don't ask them about how they have sex. Don't ask them about what their assigned name was. If they want to tell you about that, then they can, and you can explore what that means to them. But it's another microaggression if you start doing that. It's calling dead naming. So dead name is one of the terms to refer to your assigned or given name, which trans people are using less and less, because it kind of implies that you didn't exist before you came out or transitioned, or whatever that process was for you, which is always individual. and that there was no life before, which again, going back to the suicide research I was telling you about, that there's a connection between that and those kind of dissociations. But again, that's for another talk. But yeah, be careful not to perpetuate like the cisgender gaze and cissexism, and to actually perpetrate those microaggressions yourself within the therapy space. And then just before we end, there are just some other things that I'd thought about. I mentioned just now about research and studies, and that how they don't really consider non-binary people within the populations that they're researching. And yeah, so those kind of like subgroups are often lost. And then the other thing that I thought of is in terms of psychometric and psychological assessments and testing, and most of the norms that we have are according to race, age, and the binary gender. It's a problem. I don't know what the solution is. And we know that to do those like studies to get new norms and norm samples is a very, very lengthy, very expensive process. And well, we don't have many resources in our country as it is. But again, this comes back to the idea of that there isn't a non-binary public gender. And these are some of the experiences that non-binary people have to live with on a daily basis. And so I think if there's one takeaway from this presentation is the invisibility of non-binary genders and how harmful erasing of non-binary genders can be. So vleit my storie is uit. I thought one of the things that we could discuss after this is this idea of queering the binary. Often when I bring it up in conversation with people who are usually cis but kind of like identify within the binary, they can sometimes get a little bit sensies, as though, oh my god, my gender isn't going to be recognized or it's going to be erased. And it is. So I guess what I'm curious about is that line between queering or erasing the binary. And in my opinion, it's not about saying that there isn't a space for cis men and women or trans men and women, but that it's about trying to open the space up for everybody else. But I'd love to know your thoughts about it.